She would accept my pies and then leave them on the counter as if she had forgotten I was the one who made them. Once, she replaced my jar of preserves with a store-bought brand while I sat in the living room and she poured David coffee like it was a rehearsal. There were small things, a replaced photograph on the mantel, a nursery item I had embroidered, gone, replaced by a manufactured alternative. You tell yourself you're imagining it. You tell yourself that time reshapes everything and that new mothers sometimes drift.
I had heard his name in a conversation at church once, in the way you hear about someone who can be counted on. James was not the sort of private investigator you see on television with an expensive car and sunglasses. He was quiet. He had the hands of a man who'd once worked as a mechanic and spoken to people who were not used to answering to anyone. But he also had a way of sitting across from you and making you feel like you were the only thing that mattered in the room. When I met him, he put a thermos of weak coffee on my kitchen table and unfolded a worn legal pad, scrawled with years of notes. He listened. I told him nothing and everything, the small exclusions, the receipts that didn't add up, the way I had been asked to call before visits. I left him the photographs and the crumpled receipt from the Tiffany store. A week later, he called me into an office that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. He spread documents between us like you spread a map. Bank transfers, dates, names. There were copies of checks drawn to companies I had never heard of, transactions timed in ways that suggested intent, not accident. There were emails with language that seemed to craft a narrative, and there were records that had been altered, quiet forgery, the kind meant to mimic life. He told me things, straight and slow as a river. Vanessa had been married before, he said. The name on one of the marriage licenses led to San Diego. The bank statements showed siphons from accounts that weren't hers to take. There was a birth certificate filed under a name that did not match what James found in hospital logs. A little discrepancy that to most people would have been nothing. He would not call me hysterical. He called me cautious. And then he said, in a voice that made the room very small, "Margaret, there's something else. You need to sit down." I sat. He told me he had found a report, a missing persons report, old and folded in a county file, about a child named Jacob who had been reported missing from a hospital in San Diego. He told me he had matched the dates to an online birth announcement that had been scrubbed, and that the signatures on a certain set of hospital forms were not consistent with originals. He showed me a police blotter that mentioned a name, Carlos Santos, and a desperate father who had been looking for his son for months before the trail went cold. He did not make accusations. He set evidence on the table and let it cool in the air between us. When you see the knitting of something criminal, papers, dates, transfers, it is not the heat of headline making that gets you. It's the cold, logical arrangement of facts. That cold can be more terrifying because it does not have to scream to be true. Could this be coincidence? I asked. It was not a rhetorical question. It could be, James said. It could also be the work of someone who is good at hiding what they've done. It's not a conclusion, Margaret. It's a lead.
We left the office with a sheaf of copies. James wanted to dig deeper. He wanted to look into phone logs, to talk to the hospital archivist at St. Mary's in San Diego, to trace the transfers back to their sources. He promised to be careful. He promised to be thorough. There was a look in his eyes that said he had been behind doors of bad things many times and that he was not inclined to turn away. Home, I held Jacob and tried to let my hands forget the weight of suspicion. He slept on my lap with his breath like a tiny metronome. David came over that afternoon, his smile taut. He took the baby, kissed him. We did not discuss what I had learned. He looked tired in a way that pressed on me. Maybe he had been carrying shame or confusion, or both. When I tried to ask, he changed the topic politely. Sometimes family protects itself with silence, as if nothing terrifies a house more than speaking the hard thing. I began to keep copies of the documents in a place on my person. I folded them small and put them in the inside pocket of my handbag, next to the Tiffany cup. I thought about how absurd it would look if I were to go to Jacob's baptism with such a thing in my purse, how the evidence would sit beside the baby cup like a second secret offering. But I also understood that there are moments when dignity is not the same thing as surrender. When the day of the baptism came, I dressed carefully. I put on the navy dress that matched my son's old navy jacket and the pearls that tightened comfort into ritual. I pressed the cup into tissue. I took the printed report from James and folded it once so that it would not be obvious. I rehearsed a face that was neither ferocious nor blank, a face that could survive humiliation and still do what needed to be done. At the church, Vanessa's smile was practiced and white. People leaned towards her with congratulations. The room hummed like a well-tuned instrument. When David walked up, there was a moment in his eyes that I could not read. Fear, perhaps, or fury. Perhaps the shame of a man being forced to choose between two loyalties. His voice, when he told me to go, had a kind of brittle finality.
It carried. The congregation heard it as an instruction to be obeyed. I took Jacob. I laid my lips on his forehead. I told him softly, in a language that only love knows, that I would not stop. I wanted to say more, to tell him that this was not the end of anything but the beginning of a way to protect him, but the words would have been clumsy and loud and not fit the place. Outside, I dialed. I called Carlos Santos first, because there is an urgency in reaching a father and might have hope in his voice. I had the number James had given me, a contact he had made months earlier while tracing records. I called from the church steps, watching a mother adjust a ribbon on a young girl's hair as if everything were ordinary. Carlos answered on the second ring. His voice was thin with surprise and guarded hope.
I told him my name. I told him where I stood. I told him that his son was in my arms and that I had reason to believe he had been taken. He did not scream. He breathed, and then he said a string of words in Spanish and then in broken English. "Is this really Jacob?" he asked. "Are you sure?" I read him the basic facts James had discovered, what I could say without drawing breath too sharply, without embellishment. He said he had reported the child missing when he thought the hospital had lost him, that he had been told things that didn't make sense. His voice turned from wonder to a raw, hollow thing I recognized as a father who had been robbed. "Stay where you are," he said. "Please, do not let them move the child." "I won't," I said. I felt like a child myself, frightened but prepared to do the thing a parent should do. I promised him I would call the police. I dialed Millbrook's non-emergency line. My hands were steady in the way that fear can sometimes make your hands very small and efficient. The operator answered. I gave my name. I explained what I knew and gave them the details James had provided. I told them the address of the reception that would follow the baptism. I told them that a baby might have been taken and that a father had been found in San Diego who claimed him. After a long pause, the operator transferred me to Detective Linda Hayes. Detective Hayes introduced herself in the professional, measured tone of someone who has been handed the necessary and inconvenient. She asked me questions with the methodical patience of someone assembling a puzzle. How old was Jacob? Where had he been born? Who was the mother listed on his birth certificate? She asked for the names and the documents James had found. I read them aloud, and then I told her one more thing, that the woman, Vanessa, had a history that included a prior marriage and evidence of troubling financial transfers. "Can you meet us at the reception, ma'am?" she asked. I could hear the way the background noise in her headset hinted at dispatchers beginning to move. "I'll stay where I am," I said, though my instinct was to step back into the hall and watch, to do the loud and painful thing of confronting the person who had sent me from the church. Instead, I kept to the steps. I clutched the purse to my side. The Tiffany cup lay near my elbow like a witness. People walked by and offered condolences they didn't understand. I wanted to tell them what I'd learned, how threads that seem light can bind the worst things, but the detective's voice was in my ear with instructions not to speak about it publicly. I swallowed the urge to explain myself to the strangers, and breathed instead into the small, steady knowledge that I had done something no one would applaud in the moment, but a few would someday thank me for. Somewhere inside the church, the baptism carried on. A baby slumbered in arms that did not know the full story. I sat on the stone steps and read the headline of a pamphlet that listed hymn numbers, and it felt absurdly trivial. When the call ended, I tucked the phone into my hand and stared at the entrance. The reception sat behind the glass like a scene in a snow globe, garlands and cake and laughter frozen until someone shook it. I thought of Carlos and his voice, thin and hopeful. I thought of David, standing in a turmoil I could not enter. I thought of the private papers in my purse. Waiting is an active thing. It contracts the time into a small room of anticipation, where every second is a footstep. I set my fingers on the purse as if touching something that could be a talisman. I looked at my pearls, how they caught the sun and made soft moons against my throat. I told myself that being underestimated had its uses. So many of the men who had done harm to others were men who believed themselves invisible to the women who watched. They thought their small lies would go unremarked. I was not invisible. A car pulled up a short distance away. A woman hurried toward the church with a paper bag of napkins. An old friend of mine from choir passed and nodded in that way that means she does not want to pry. Nothing about the ordinary world prepared for what that small, steady action of making 2 phone calls would set in motion. The evidence in my purse felt suddenly heavier than the cup. I had not planned for drama. I had planned for truth. I had not wanted to become the kind of grandmother who unseats a family. I had wanted to safeguard a child's life.
If what James had uncovered was true, then a stranger's hands had been involved in a child's entry into this family. A thought passed through me, as precise as a bell. Sometimes the best protection is the one no one gets to see coming. I folded my hands around the purse, feeling the ridged edges of the documents beneath my palm. The door opened and the soft murmur of the reception began to seep out in waves. Children's laughter cut like a small blade. Somewhere inside, someone raised a glass. My phone buzzed. It was James. He said 2 words, "Stay put." I did. The world hung, waiting for an answer that could change the shape of more than one life. Stay put. Those 2 words from James sounded small through the phone, but they were the axes on which everything turned. I did not move. I sat on the church steps feeling the sun warm my shoulders and the weight of the purse in my lap, the documents under my fingers, like a promise that truth could be folded and carried. I watched the reception through the DAS and kept my mouth closed because Detective Hayes had asked me to, and because sometimes the quietest thing you do is the most loud. A black SUV rolled into the curb a few minutes later. It seemed almost indecent how ordinary it looked, but nothing about that day was ordinary anymore.
Detective Linda Hayes came up the steps in sensible shoes, her badge clipped at her belt, and a phone stuck to her ear. Behind her walked a woman with a certain federal crispness, Agent Patricia Marrow, whose presence turned the small-town drama into something broader than the parish hall could have imagined. Detective Hayes crouched beside me to speak in a tone that was both kind and efficient. "We want you to stay where you are," she said. "No one will touch the child. We are going to move in quietly and take custody if necessary." I felt a small, ridiculous urge to apologize for my pearls and navy dress. The thought was absurd. None of my clothes had caused any of this. Still, people dress for ceremonies as if the fabric can hold the meaning of a life. For a moment, I imagined the pearls were armor. I watched them move through the reception with the measured grace of professionals. They didn't shout. They didn't bang through doors. They opened the glass doors with a knock of authority and a quiet that made the room tilt toward them. There was a murmur, then a ripple of confusion. Vanessa's smile faltered like a photograph being turned too fast. David's face was a fault line. You could see something break under the skin. They escorted her gently to a corner and asked questions. She answered. Her answers were the practiced ones of someone who had rehearsed truth until it fit like a borrowed glove. Then Detective Hayes showed a photograph and a sheet of paper. There was a moment, only one, where everything in Vanessa's face shifted. The practiced smile dropped. She asked for her attorney in a voice that sounded composed because she had to make it sound composed. They told her she was being detained. For what, I could not hear at first. It sounded unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. And then 2 men in plain clothes moved forward and said something about federal jurisdiction. Agent Marrow introduced herself and said words like kidnapping and federal that made the reception room swell with a new gravity. People reached for their phones. Someone screamed that they couldn't believe it. Carlos came in minutes later, led by a detective who had called him on our information from San Diego. He stumbled, his face riven with a kind of feral relief, and for a second the world narrowed to his arms reaching for the child he'd thought he'd lost. I watched him take Jacob and felt a thing I had not expected. Joy so sharp it almost hurt. Jacob's small body made a soft fit against Carlos's chest. The baby fussed a little, then settled. It was a human reconnection, a father reunited with a son. I had no right to the drama. I had done what I could. For a long time, Carlos kept mumbling the baby's name as if saying it out loud confirmed his presence in the world. David folded in on himself in one of those human collapses that is not drama but grief. He could not meet my eyes. Later, much later, he told me he had been living in a kind of fog fueled by lies he had not been able to see through. He was devastated in a way that made my heart split, because he was also a victim. He loved Jacob in a way that was real. He had been manipulated too. Vanessa was taken into custody at the reception, the room filled with whispers, with the stunned silence that follows when civility is cracked. Someone pressed a hand to their mouth and then led a child away. I stepped back and for the first time since I had walked out of the baptism, allowed myself to breathe. What followed was a flurry of document seizure and careful interviews. Detective Hayes and Agent Marrow coordinated with a calm that was calculated to make sure everything was collected the right way. James appeared a little while later, his expression relieved but unreadable. He had worked through the night to tie together other little clues, an email chain, a forged signature, transfers to a series of shell companies that seem to exist only for moving money around. They took Vanessa in. They took her phone. They took her purse. They photographed the place she had stood. They lifted what looked like a child's medical file from a folder I later learned included falsified entries, records that had been manufactured to create a paper trail that put Jacob where they wanted him on paper, if not in truth. I went home that night with my pearls feeling heavier than they had when I arrived. Martha called and said she had watched the news and would be right over. I made peppermint tea and sat on the couch and felt near to collapse. I did not. You learn in certain crises that the world continues to require a small practical attention: where to put the baby's blanket, whom to call next, how to answer an email from a reporter without giving yourself away. I folded a towel and placed it over the Tiffany cup as if shielding it from any more trouble. In the days that followed, the case unfurled into something larger than a family tragedy. Agent Marrow assembled a team from the FBI's criminal division and called the investigation Operation False Promise. The name did not flatter the perpetrators. It was a clinical shorthand for a scheme that used constructed identities and emotional manipulation to move people and money. What had started as a private grief for a man named Carlos was revealed to be an engine of calculated predation. We learned that Vanessa had not acted alone. There were ledgers and lists, names and dates. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychologist brought in by the defense at first and then by one of the prosecution teams, sat with me in a small interview room and explained in gentle terms how networks like this recruit and maintain control. She spoke of narratives woven to isolate family members, of gaslighting tactics tailored to make loved ones doubt their own perceptions, of papers, birth certificates, medical notes, hospital forms, crafted to look authentic.
They manufacture authority, she said, and authority is how they make people yield. There were victims on paper who were real in life, Eleanor Mitchell and Miguel Rodriguez among them. Eleanor's death had at first been written as an accident. There were notes in police files that later seemed to suggest otherwise, enough for the FBI to include her case in the chart of the network's victims. Miguel Rodriguez had been murdered, a fact the prosecutor would later summarize in court as one of the network's most brutal results when things had to be silenced. I will not go into the particulars. There was no virtue in recreating pain, but I will say this. Each name on that ledger represented a life altered or ended, and to read the list was to feel the slow gathering of evil into a pattern. They found a journal during a search of a property connected to Dr. Harrison Blackwood, a name we heard handed around in cautious tones at briefings. The journal contained the sort of clinical cruelty that made you cold, strategies for recruiting vulnerable people, notes on background creation, a terminology for cleanup. There were references to placement protocols and to language that would be used to create believable histories and medical records. The journal read like a practitioner's manual for deception. Architect, Agent Morrow called him in one briefing. He built the system. It was a label that fit. Dr. Blackwood's life was one of professional respectability, a doctorate, a private practice, the kind of CV that lends an air of trustworthiness to whatever a man says. In the end, it was precisely that trust that the network weaponized. There were long, clinical days of evidence gathering. Forensics went through bank transfers with magnifying glass patients. James's earlier inquiries tied 3 different shell accounts to transfers out of David's accounts, subtle redirections of money that, when arranged together, pointed toward not just opportunistic theft but a plan. There were notarized documents that, upon expert examination, had been passed through several hands and altered. We learned what it meant to have paperwork be the armor someone uses to make a lie enforceable. The FBI prepared charges: kidnapping, wire fraud, conspiracy, bigamy. Vanessa's previous marriage in San Diego was now evidence of a pattern of constructing alternate lives, and a list of associated crimes that implicated others. The scope widened. Agent Morrow called in an evidence team that methodically photographed, cataloged, and preserved. The precision made me feel as if we were behaving like the truth itself had weight and presence. Then, in a turn that scared me more than I expected it to, Vanessa managed to get out of local custody. It was not a chase through the movies with growling tires and crashing glass. It was, tragically, the outcome of a calculated extraction, where the wrong smallness, an inexperienced guard, and overplayed legal technicality became the wedge.
She disappeared for a short time, and for a while we were told only that the extraction looked professional. They brought me to a safe house after that. It felt like being wrapped in wool. Practical, isolating, necessary. Agents came and went at all hours. Martha stayed nearby, and David sat with his hands between his knees and watched the news, as if any anchor might be able to stitch him back together. The FBI took measures I cannot describe in detail for safety reasons. What I will say is that people in dark suits were everywhere, and my life shrank to a few important rooms where I ate bland food and slept in the daylight. Vanessa's escape forced my hand. I could have stayed quiet and let officials do their work, but I had something they needed: presence in the courtroom, the small human memory of the baptism, and the way the papers sat in my purse. There are moments when you realize that facts, neat and printed on paper, will not always sway a jury the way a steady, truthful person can. So I told them I would testify. They tried to argue me out of it, not to save me, but to spare me. "We can use the documents," they said. "You don't have to come out." But I couldn't leave the telling to paper. Paper does not tell the way you felt the air shift when David told you to leave in a voice like an order. Paper does not hold the small, incandescent gestures of a man whose life had been rearranged. So I agreed. I would testify in person. If my voice could keep one family from being further used, then I would lend it. The courtroom was a place of ritual, wood polished to a deep sheen, the flag in its corner, the judge's bench raised like an altar of law. I sat in a narrow chair that felt too small for someone with a lifetime of stories. The prosecution team arranged their notebooks with mechanical calm. Agent Marrow sat near the table, a steady presence. James was there too. Him, Detective Hayes, and Carlos, who had become Jacob's guardian again, and who sat with a protective hand on the stroller whenever the court allowed him in. We rehearsed the testimony more often than logic would dictate. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, functioning now as a consultant in comfort, talked me through the idea that being nervous was normal, and that jurors respect truth when it is delivered plainly. "Stick to what you know," she said. "Be honest. If you don't know, say so." On the stand, I felt the floor of my life tilt the way it had on the church steps. The prosecutor asked me about the day of the baptism. I told them what I had felt: the sharpness of David's voice, the warmth of Jacob's head under my lips, the weight of the Tiffany cup in my purse. I read aloud from the documents James had given me: the bank transfers, the forged signature expert's note, the hospital forms that did not match the originals. I told the jury the sequence of our calls: Carlos, then the police. When I said these things, the courtroom felt as if it were leaning in to hear me breathe.
Then came cross-examination. The defense tried to paint me as unstable, a woman whose age and emotion made her unreliable. They held up copies of a medical file that, they said, showed a history of confusion. It was the moment every person who has ever been dismissed fears: documents used to make your truth into a question. The defense attorney was sharp in a way that was designed to unmoor me. He asked questions in a rhythm meant to unsettle me, and for a moment I felt my hands go light and my words thinned. But the prosecution had anticipated the line of attack. Detective Hayes brought forward the forensic report that showed the medical file the defense used had been altered. The handwriting expert testified about the ink's age. An evidence technician confirmed the metadata on the file. James testified about the chain of custody and his methods. Dr. Martinez explained how such manipulations serve as a classic strategy in networks like the one we were confronting, manufacturing doubt to render witnesses ineffective. At one point, the defense held up a sheet and said, "Mrs. Thompson, doesn't this show you were seeking attention?" And I answered, "No." It was the simplest answer. No theatricality, just a short, honest negation. The jury listened. The courtroom filled with small, precise acts of proof: phones with data, ledgers with transfers, a journal with entries that matched the pattern of misdirection. The web they'd built out of dignity and fabrication started to look fragile. Agent Moreau's testimony was the one that made me feel as if the legal world could hold what I'd had to do with my hand shaking on a pavement. She spoke of the ledger of victims, of the way Dr. Blackwood's name turned up in multiple contacts in payment streams, and of the placement protocol language found in the journal. She did not sensationalize. She said plainly that the evidence pointed to a coordinated effort to create legal cover for illegal acts, from forged documents to targeted abuse. When the prosecution announced charges against Dr. Blackwood, I remember feeling something like relief and a queasy sadness at the same time. How can someone whose life appears so honored be capable of designing harm? We are often tempted to believe that respectability is a shield. It isn't. Vanessa's escape, the FBI said, had been an attempt to prevent testimony. They recaptured her after a short manhunt that involved a coordinated effort across several states. The recapture was quiet but efficient. She was brought back to face the charges in handcuffs. The prosecution added charges associated with the escape and with threats that had been uncovered in the course of the investigation. Threats to witnesses and to anyone who might speak. There were protocols discovered, notes with names, and suggestions that violent cleanup was part of how certain members of the network operated.
The evidence read like a ledger of moral bankruptcy.
The trial stretched over days that felt like months. Witnesses came and went, some with quiet courage, and some whose faces were tired with the knowledge they'd been used. There was a family man who testified about a woman who had disappeared after contact with the network. There was a researcher who walked through emails and timestamps that mapped a pattern. Each testimony was a bead on a string that showed the necklace of wrongdoing. I sat through it and watched and kept my own story measured and true. The defense tried every trick they could. They called character witnesses who painted Vanessa as warm and sincere in other contexts. They tried to argue that the ledger was circumstantial, that the journals were coincidental. But the weight of the documents, the bank transfers, the forged hospital documents, the string of people who had been manipulated, built into a case that was hard to dismantle. When Dr. Blackwood eventually took the stand, I noticed a small clinical anger in the way he answered. He seemed to believe that intellect could make you untouchable. The prosecutor asked about his contacts with Vanessa and about the notes in his journal. He denied involvement. Under cross-examination, however, the threads of evidence began to loop around explanations that were too contrived. Witnesses who had been associated with financial transactions tied to his accounts produced records. Phone logs placed him in contact with people who coordinated placements. The jury saw a pattern. The facade of professional respectability began to peel. Guilty verdicts are always a moment of subdued thunder. They arrive after hours of deliberation with a kind of formal weight. The jury came back and read the verdicts: guilty on kidnapping, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on wire fraud, and guilty on other relevant counts for Vanessa. For Dr. Blackwood, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on racketeering-related counts, guilty on charges that reflected the network's systemic design. The judge pronounced sentences that, given the gravity and scope of the crimes, included life terms for the ringleaders. I will not revel in the exact years handed down. There is nothing celebratory in that. But there was relief that the law had recognized the harm. Despite the convictions, the shadow of danger did not vanish overnight. We learned that the network had been wider than initially thought, with loose tendrils that had touched other states. There were people still under investigation, and the FBI continued to pursue leads. For a long time, I slept with a light on. Thankfully, the protective detail remained in place until the danger diminished to a manageable hum. One of the most difficult parts of the aftermath was the way the family had to be rebuilt from broken parts. David went to therapy with Dr. Rebecca Martinez. The work was slow and not tidy. He had to grieve the child he thought he'd fathered and reconcile with the fact that his trust had been used.
He also had to accept the humiliation of having been persuaded by a person he loved. Therapy, we learned, is not about blame so much as understanding the mechanisms that made the deception possible. David did the hard work. He learned to set boundaries. He learned to examine documents with a care he had not known before. He began to speak to men in groups who had been manipulated in similar ways. It was quiet work, like mending a torn dress over the course of nights, but it was honest. Carlos and Jacob moved to a modest apartment not far from my house. Carlos wanted a place where Jacob could run in a safe yard and where the child could grow into a life that was more ordinary than the one he had been forced into. I watched them at the park sometimes, Jacob toddling after pigeons and Carlos laughing in a way that was both raw and pure. I brought the Tiffany cup out of its towel one afternoon and handed it to Carlos with the small ceremony we both understood. He pressed the cup into Jacob's small hands and said in Spanish and in the kind of gratitude that had no words, "Gracias." Rebuilding family was not simply about returning things to the way they were. It was about making new arrangements informed by the truth. David and Carlos had hard conversations and made a plan for visits in custody that prioritized the child's well-being. They did not attempt to reconstruct an idealized family. They constructed what was possible and safe. There was no neat reunion where everything snapped back into place. There was instead a series of committed acts, appointments kept, therapy sessions attended, small promises made and not broken. Martha, my sister, kept me fed and steady. She made soup, which is what sisters do. She drove over one afternoon with a bag of clothes and a pair of stories that were meant to make me laugh and had the desired effect. The garden behind my house became a place of small reclamations. I pruned roses that had been neglected and planted lavender because the scent seemed to help things breathe. Simple acts of tending felt like a quiet defiance against the way our lives had been used. I remember a moment, months after the verdict, when the danger had receded enough that the protective detail was no longer a daily presence. I sat on a bench in the park with Jacob on my lap, his small fingers exploring the ridges of the Tiffany cup's handle. A man from our church, one of the older deacons, sat down beside me and said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at Jacob and said, "You did the right thing." It was a small affirmation that felt like sun on my face. We were not the only family affected,
The FBI reported that Operation False Promise had prevented further abuses and that several other cases, once purely isolated tragedies, were now seen as connected. There were families whose brief had been given a new context. In some cases, there was consolation that the truth was being pursued.
The investigators recovered records showing how identities had been built and dismantled, the ways clean tissues of paper were draped over crimes to make them passable. The journal, the bank records, the transfer logs, each piece was a small victory for fact over fiction. Back in the quiet of my house one evening, David asked a question that was more confession than curiosity. "Mom," he said, "did you ever think you'd be the one to do that? The calling, the going public, the refusing to be silent?" I thought of that navy dress and the pearls and the cup and the face I'd made outside the church when I walked away. I thought of James in his office and of Detective Hayes and Agent Morrow and the tiny, stubborn way I had decided not to let fear make me small. I thought of a lot of things, I said. Mostly, I thought of Jacob's hands. He reached for my hand, and we sat there for a while without saying much. Words are often clumsy instruments for mending what trust has been used to rip. But trust reassembles itself again in the small habits, showing up, telling the truth, asking good questions. Years pass, as they do. Jacob learned to call me Grandma the same way a child learns new colors, with trial and then with certainty. He is mostly a normal boy who likes trucks and the smell of chocolate, and when he runs toward me at the park with arms wide, it makes something in me feel as if the world has rights again. I am careful with him in the way a steward cares for a treasure. I teach him to press his palms into the dirt and name the worms, and to say hello to neighbors with a firm voice. These are small lessons in a life that once depended on being shielded from adults who pretended to be other than they were. I am often asked why I didn't stage a drama in the church, why I didn't shout Vanessa down, why I didn't march to the pulpit and demand answers. The short answer is that dignity can be a weapon too. The long answer is that I had learned to keep a purse with evidence and to make 2 phone calls that let professionals do the wrestling. There are many ways to fight a lie. Sometimes the most effective is the least theatrical. What I will not forget is how it felt to be underestimated. People thought me the kind grandmother who would be easy to silence because she loved her family, and because older women are often written into softer narratives. That underestimation proved to be an asset. I could move without drawing suspicion. I could listen in ways others might not. It is not that I sought advantage. It is that the world often misreads the quiet as weakness. I used my quiet like a lantern. There are things I will always carry. The weight of the knowledge that other families were harmed will not disappear. The news clippings, the courtroom transcripts, the small bag with photocopies of ledgers, these are objects that retain a kind of gravity. But there is also a brightness to carry. The image of Carlos holding his son for the first time in years, the sound of Jacob's laughter, David learning to trust that not all people will lie to him. Justice cannot return time. It cannot make everything right, but it can remove the dangerous illusions that let predators operate. If there is one truth I hope people take from what happened, it is this: listening is a form of protection. To the mother who thinks she is being dismissed, to the neighbor who wonders about an odd transfer, to the grandmother who finds herself subtly excluded, pay attention. Do not let social niceties be a shroud for predation. Ask questions. Keep copies. Speak to someone who knows what to look for. We did not have all the answers at first, but we had enough to start looking, and once you start, the path becomes less about shame and more about action. When the dust settled and the convicts were led away, life did not return to being the same as before. It returned to being ours, with new boundaries and shared responsibilities. We learned to protect one another in ways that were practical and sometimes tedious. We learned to confer before decisions were made, to double-check documents, to speak up. The family that emerged was not unscarred, but it was wiser. People sometimes ask me if I think God had a hand in any of it. I am not a theologian who will pronounce on providence. I can only say that I prayed in small ways,
like an ordinary woman who talks to the air and hopes the words find a place to rest. I am grateful for the professionals who did their jobs well, for the investigators who did not tire, and for the human will to keep truth in motion. My faith provided context, comfort when things were terrible, but what drove the case forward were facts, persistence, and the legal system doing its difficult work. That is how we saw convictions, and for a while, safety restored. Sometimes on a mild afternoon when the maple trees cast soft shadows on my lawn, I take the Tiffany cup out and polish it gently until it sings. Jacob will be older than the story one day, and maybe he will learn the way we learned, by small actions stitched together. He will hear how a grandmother's patience and willingness to act saved a life. He will also learn how fragile trust can be, and how brave people who do ordinary things with careful hearts can make extraordinary difference. To every person who watched us fight and cheered us on from the sidelines, thank you. To the investigators who would not let the paper trail rest, thank you. To the family who stayed and the one who returned, thank you for the love that can still be built from truth. If this story has spoken to you, please consider liking, sharing, or leaving a comment about what surprised you most. Small acts like that help stories reach others who might need to hear them. People will always underestimate certain women, certain grandmothers.
But underestimated doesn't mean powerless. I kissed my grandson and walked out of a church with a plan. That quiet decision was the hinge on which everything turned. It is a small comfort to know that a woman who was told to leave did not leave the truth behind.